a production of the South Carolina Educational Television Network.
Hello, I'm Patty Just. Our guest on this program is James Dickey, poet, novelist, and critic. To tell you a little bit about his background, he was born in Atlanta, Georgia. He received his BA and MA from Vanderbilt University in between two military stints in the U.S. Army during the Second World War and in the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War. He's received many prizes and awards for his books, and he was the first Carolina professor and poet in residence at the University of South Carolina, and now lives in Columbia. Two books we're going to be talking about primarily are Deliverance, his novel that was turned into a major motion picture, and the newest book, The Whole Motion, Collected Poems, 1945 through 1992. Mr. Dickey, welcome to our program.
Well, it's nice to be here today.
Thank you so much for our time here at your home.
Sure. Happy to do it.
You've had an unusually full life. You had a career as a pilot and in advertising, and then in midlife turned to writing.
Well, I was writing a long time before I began publishing very much. I didn't have a first book until I was 37. This was in 1960, which is relatively late in the day for a lyric poet, which I was at that time, also I thought myself to be. To have a first book at 37, but there have been people older than that who published first books. Wallace Stevens was one. The novelist Joseph Conrad was one. And when you think of Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, who was not published until he was 62, my case is not so exceptional after all.
Well, tell me about that, growing up in Atlanta and
well, I grew up during the Depression, although I don't remember that we ever suffered very much from it. But I mean, nobody had very much, but things didn't cost anything hardly. I mean, I remember when my family and I were outraged when they raised the price of a haircut from 25 to 35 cents. And now look what it costs.
A lot more than that.
Yeah, and so on. But I had a very pleasant childhood. My family was, mother and father were very sympathetic in whatever the children wanted to do. We got complete backing from them. My mother was an invalid with heart disease and so on, but she was still extremely influential on all of us. And my father was a lawyer, and we had Hemingway says it was a prerequisite for a writer to have had an unhappy childhood, but it's not true in my case. I had a very nice time. The sixth grade was probably the highest point of my life.
What happened then?
I just had a lot of good friends, and I loved all the sports that we played, and we had a nice swinging teacher, Miss McDonald, in the sixth grade of E. Rivers Grammar School. We had a great big playground at the school, you know, and lots of good fun.
What were you thinking about when it came time to choose a career?
Well, I was essentially, just after I got out of high school, I went into the service like everybody else in my generation. And my values are more or less formed by the war years. I look on existence sort of from the standpoint of a survivor. And I'm happy to see the sun come up every morning. But I'm essentially a creature of the military. I was in twice. I was in the Air Force, what used to be called the Army Air Force, or Army Air Corps, and then they changed the name to the U.S. Air Force, and I was recalled in 1950 during the Korean War. So I was in a long time. I was in twice, and then between those two times I tried to get educated as best I could. I went to a very good school and had very good teachers, and very enthusiastic about what I was beginning to try to do. And then after that, I traveled a lot. I lived in Europe a couple of times for extended periods, and I lived in Oregon. I lived in Los Angeles, or right outside in the San Fernando Valley, and then I was at the Library of Congress for 2 years, for 2 terms there as poet laureate. That's what it would be now. It was then called poetry consultant to the library, but it's the same thing, same job, same office, and so on. And then I came down here 25 years ago, and I've been sort of using this as a command post and going out and making forays, or as one of my books is called, sorties, out into the other places and so on from here. But it's nice to have a fixed abode, I can tell you, because before that I was just traveling all the time.
You had so much excitement in that first part of your life, and you're able to carry that over into your poetry, into your writing.
Well, I think excitement is quite a good word to use in connection with writing, but as you get older, I'll be 70 next Groundhog Day, and one of the more difficult things to do is to maintain your sense of excitement and discovery about what you write, and you have to devise your own stratagems to do that, and I've got a bunch of them. And usually they work okay.
What was publishing like in the earlier days when you first started putting some of your work out?
Well, I had never published anything except in the school magazine, the Vanderbilt literary magazine, the Gadfly. But I began to send out to national magazines without much luck. I'd get back lots of, form rejection slips and so on. But I sent some things into the Swanee Review, which was the literary quarterly that I thought was the best one, and I still do think it is. The poems were rejected, but after all the form rejection slips I had gotten, here at last was one with something written by the human hand on it. It said, "Not bad."
So did you frame that one?
No, I don't have it, I don't think, but that was quite encouraging, and then I sent them some more and then began to publish them.
And that was exciting for you, I know.
Not bad.
Not bad. Talking generally about poetry, what is the difference between a good and a great poem?
I think it's the bodying forth of a singular human sensibility that can only be given out by means of not only by means of words, but by means of those words. So you gain something from reading it. Something enters into your life attitude, or your life spirit, blood even, you get from that. I remember the poet W.H. Auden talking about that. He says, when you read a good poem, you think, I've thought that a lot of times, but because I couldn't say it that well. It was the 18th century concept of poetic merit, or what was then called wit, which means something a little different from what we call wit. It meant mainly imagination itself. But you said it was Alexander's notion was, as he says, true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. This Auden says this is what you feel when you read a good poem. But when you read a great poem, you don't feel that. You think, my goodness, look at what this guy says. I could never have thought of anything like this in a million years, but it's much better than the way I did think of it. So consequently, I'll see it this way from now on until something even better comes along, which probably it won't.
Does it put a lot of pressure on you as a poet to write a great poem?
Well, I don't think about greatness at all. I think about, for years, it was becoming fatally easy to me to write poetry that would be good enough to publish. But I didn't publish any of it because I wanted another element in it. I wanted something that had my stamp on it, and that nobody but me could have written. Not just that any number of American poets could have written it, and they're all good and respectable and so on. I wanted something that had my stamp on it, and that I had to sweat for. That was hard. That was very tough to get. But when you get it, you know you've got it.
And people have called you one of the major poets of the day.
Well, I don't know. I don't bother about those things. I just want to write something that satisfies my own standards. Then they can make of it whatever they like.
What about this latest book of yours, The Whole Motion? You decided to put a collection
Well,
of many years
the publisher
together.
wanted to do it. I had a similar collection in 1967, which was the Skull Poems, 1957, 67. But I had written a good deal since that time, and they wanted something with everything in it. So I had written some of my earlier collections were recollected, and one of them was called The Early Motion, and another one was called The Central Motion, and now this is The Whole Motion. My little 11-year-old girl says, "What are you going to do if you're going to write any more?" I said, "Well, I hope to write some more." I said, "Well, if this is The Whole Motion, you won't have it. What are you going to title the last one if you do one more, maybe? Or maybe The Last Motion, or the ultimate motion."
There are many words.
The final motion.
That's right.
The dying motion.
But in it, you do see some of the changes in your
Yes,
style.
I hope the people who are interested in my work from that standpoint will see what they are.
Well,
And I have several books. Some that have already been written on me, but there are many more coming, and so they'll have the whole canon now, at least up to this point, to trace out whatever influences they want to try to find, or whatever changes and progressions or retrogressions or whatever I might have gone through during all these years.
One of the things I picked up on right away was the way you changed the way you write the poetry. First, in the beginning of the book, it's all traditional lines.
Yes,
Toward the end, you have the spaces in there for the
Yes,
reader.
I still have a very great respect and regard for traditional poetry and the traditional forms. I teach that of a year's course in verse composition. I teach that for a whole half year at the university, because the students need that. Most of them have no discipline at all, and you need to make them work with words in the same sense that they would work with a given sort of physical material, like rock, if it were a sculpture, or clay, or something like that. Words, and you respect the language and see what it'll do, and what you can ask it to do, and what it can't do. You need to know that the latter equally, with equal force, what you can't ask it to do.
And the new way with the spaces, is that a way to help people
Well,
know how
no,
you meant it?
it's an attempt to get consciousness itself stated like it more truly is than just a regular unbroken line of poetry. It seems to be that the mind, as far as it associates by means of words, does it in jumps, kind of gaps, and between which there is not anything. You know, and then another group of words will appear, and then nothing, and then another one, and so on. It's very irregular, but it really is. And it gives to the poem, especially if it's a narrative of some sort, a tremendous sense of urgency, because you don't know what's going to be said. You know, you don't know or whether anything is, or what might be said. That was an interesting way to work. I thought so.
Could you read something from the book for us?
Sure, if you pick it out.
Certainly.
You want me to read an early one?
Read an early one and then a
one?
later one.
Yeah, this is one I wrote in college, and I never sent it out, but a scholar, very nice one, an intelligent one named Gordon Van Ness, wanted these collected and persuaded me to collect these in this book and have a whole section of them. There are about 40 or 50 of them that I never collected, and they're a good many. I mean, I read through them. I thought, you know, I can see where this one's not exactly way I would do it now, but it's good, and I ought to let that younger fella have his say, you know. If I think it's good enough to publish, I think we should bring it out. This is about being overseas. It's called The Place of the Skull, which, as you remember, is what was Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified on the place of the skull. This is different, though. This is about one of the islands, Okinawa, where I was really getting into the flood stage of enthusiasm for poetry, and I had some anthologies over there that I would I guarded with my life, and nobody else wanted to read poetry anyway, so they let me alone. So I would go out, some of them, after I'd fly at night and it'd get too hot in the tent to sleep, I would pour some water over my head, and I didn't have to do anything until briefing in the afternoon for the next mission. See, I was in a night fighter squadron, we just flew at night. And I would pour some water over my head and take up the poetry books and go out on the cliff overlooking the bay with all the ships, the supply ships and invasion ships and ships that were out there. It was beautiful to see. And I thought, you know, this is really my salvation, because I really do want to survive this war and go get into poetry further, maybe even write it, you know. So, but then later on, when I did a certain amount of that, I felt a little bit guilty about it, because I felt that I had tapped into a source that my companions didn't have, you know, that there was something exclusive and even snobbish about it, you know. And I began to have sort of second thoughts. I didn't quit doing it, but the poetry was kind of my secret vice that was going to save me. So this is about that, the place of the skull. I used to get up in the tent, in the canvas sewn over the stroke and shimmer of the inside of an orange, and from my banged canteen the cup tipped full of a curve of water and pour it out on my head. The air would be breathless, the others would be breathing it, all asleep. Across the downed gilt of the canvas, the shadow of a fly in the outside world would go like a bullet, saying, "Maze." I would dry my hands and pick up the poetry books and walk through the area out, over the rise with the crumbled machine gun pit, and the licked, light, chalky dazzle kicking the laces of my shoes along, until sea blue from under my belt trembled up, as down to a bench in the stillest side of height I came to meet my holy masters in the Word, above the gauze and powder-burning bay. I would sit all morning and read in the sun, the page coming off my eye more quivered in than all the blue danced up by the miles of centerless waves that spread to say if I reached off the book, my hand would die in the sea of fire with Shelley and with Crane, and never touch the ships that anchored there. The spirit moving on the face of print left out the nights, when past the honest sleepers of the fleet I rose in starry harness on the air, and in my rubber mouth, from out the slender breeze of oxygen, I made a song of what I meant to kill before I poured my hanging head from a can of water and sat again above the bay, which loved the Word, and caught my ships, country ships, in such a full and furious holocaust of soul. The lines of ashen text marked off the graves where all my men who sail the ships must die for lack of good that I drew off the page. I bit the silent tongue of men and angels, reading on in the sound of engines run up on the strip, a grizzle of fly wings, saying, "Who asks for truth at a time like this is shut from pity and will slay his own, whose vision kills the meaning of his view. Only the larger war with God half knows such seeming peace."
Does that give you a real sense of satisfaction reading that
Yeah,
many years later?
to know that I was good that early, you know, because I had so many doubts for so long, and I still do have them, but I've had, you know, you think the real old Harry is in that guy. You know, he might stumble once in a while, but any young poet does that, and most of the older ones.
All right, let's move on to a later one.
Okay. Let's see. This is about Fort Jackson right over there. When I first moved here, it used to disturb my early morning sleep to hear them drilling over there. And you hear the guns going off and field problems and so on. I thought, man, that is disturbing. It's sort of like some ghostly takeover army waiting for the day or something, you know. Then it became reassuring, you know. God, we're really protected around here. You know, then it became reassuring. Then it became sinister again. And you know, this is about that. Yeah, but this is a peacetime army, you know. But they are an army. They're getting, you know, ready to fight. You know, it's what it's all about over there across the lake. So this is called Drums Where I Live. So that sleeping and waking, drum, drum, every day the first part of the sun, its upper rim and rhythm, I live here. I and my family pass in the new house, in the great light, mumbling 1, 2, 3, 4, marching in place like boys laid out, all voices of the living and the dead to come and hovering between, brought in to cadence. It is not a heart, but many men. Someone said it is comforting to hear them. Not every sun-up, neighbor. Now and then I wish I had a chance to take my chances with silence. More and more they seem to be waiting for the day. More and more as my son sighs all over the house intercom. I know he is counting his years. When we rise, the drums have stopped. But I know from the jungle of childhood movies what that means. There is nothing in the grenades coming closer bursts to worry anyone. They are expanding the range. It is only in the morning paper that a trainee hangs himself on the obstacle course. And it is nothing but nerves that make something human, a cry, float like a needle on the sunlight from the stockade. But every night I sleep assured that the drums are going to reach me at dawn like light where I live. And my heart, my blood, and my family will assemble 4 barely livable counts. Dismissed personnel, the sun is clear of basic training. This time, this is my war. And where in God's name did it start? In peace, 2, 3, 4. In peace, 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 peace. 1, 2, in sleep.
Another good one.
But different. Right?
But different, right?
Yeah, different.
Let's move on now to Deliverance. We have about 5 minutes left.
Right.
What were your expectations for that book? It was your first novel?
I didn't have any idea. I had never published any fiction before, not even a short story, not even in the Gadfly, the school magazine. I had never published any fiction, and I didn't even know whether it would be publishable or not. I just, the notion of it started when I lived in Italy. I lived in a little fishing village down south of Naples, between Sorrento and Amalfi. And I was over there, and I had some poems in a magazine, the Virginia Quarterly Review, that won some prize that they gave. And this agent from New York wrote to me and said he really had liked the poems, and they were mostly about North Georgia and the mountains. And had I ever thought about a novel? And I hadn't. It had never occurred to me. But he had put the weevil in my brain, the maggot in my brain, so I started thinking about it. And I wrote to him. I didn't have any ideas for novels. I didn't have any slightest notion about it. So, but I got to thinking about it, and I thought about this, and I thought about that, and what would it be like, and what would it be about. I still couldn't come up with anything. So I had one of those big noon Italian meals, and that was taking a siesta. And I thought, I don't know what to, I've told this guy I let out. I've cut off that possibility of somebody being interested in a novel I might write. But I still don't have any ideas. Wait a minute now. Wait a minute. How about this? An image had come into my mind of a man standing at the top of a cliff. I didn't know whether he came from inland from the cliff or whether he had come up the cliff. But in 5 minutes, I knew the whole story. I knew who the people were going to be. I knew what was going to happen to them, and so on. 7 or 8 years later, I finished it and published it.
Then the hit book, and then the hit movie.
Well, it seems a sort of a folk myth now. Everybody refers to it in one way or the other. Either they like it, or they put out by some things in it, but they don't. They remember it.
You wrote the screenplay for the movie.
Yes, I did. We had to go back and forth. Screenplay writing is difficult because everybody wants something different. Yes, I did the screenplay. And
it was very true to the book.
Well, I tried to make it as much as they would allow me to do. As far as the book is better than the movie, I think. Maybe I'm prejudiced, but we made a very good try. I think I enjoy seeing it. I like the music very much, and I like some of the whitewater canoe running and all that very much. I think it's very exciting.
People still come up and talk to you about it?
All the time, yes, sure. Yes, I just finished the screenplay for the second novel, Out on the Line, which is quite different from that. But it's too frustrating for me to write movies. As I say, everybody wants something different. movies as a group think enterprise. I'd rather just get off in the corner with a piece of paper and a pencil and write something that suits me.
You say the second one, Al Nilam, is better than Deliverance.
Much. Oh yes, it is. It has I think, a philosophical, if I do say so myself, a philosophical depth in it that makes Deliverance look small and neat. Although I like it, I read Deliverance every couple of years. It's still good. I would do it the same way again.
What's the second one about?
It's about blind men in airplanes, or a blind man in airplanes. It's about a very self-willed, semi-literate fellow who is a carpenter and who also runs a swimming pool sort of amusement park complex. This is during the war, and he's divorced and he has not remarried. He's had one child that he scarcely saw more than once or twice when the child was an infant, that has grown up with his mother in another city, in Memphis, and has joined the Air Force. And he gets the man goes blind. The central character, Frank Cahill, goes blind from diabetes, and he gets a telegram from his son's commanding officer in primary training school that his son has been killed, or at least presumed dead, disappeared, and presumed dead, and has named the father as next of kin instead of the mother who raised him. And the blind man, partly to test himself to see how he can get along as a blind man, and partly out of simple curiosity and to have something to do, he goes to the training base in North Carolina to see what he can find out. And the story of Al Nilam is what happens to him.
Did the fame from the novels help support and sustain the poetry?
Not really. I think it really takes the focus off of it in ways that I don't particularly like, because my main thrust is poetry. It's not novels. Novels are just a spin-off from that. Poetry is the main and the rare, unswerving discipline that I follow.
What is that James Dickey stamp?
Stamp? I don't know. It's the ability to say something astonishingly illuminating without seeming to raise my voice. That's the hardest part too, to take the effort out of it, so that it seems naturally said, but astonishing. I want to be simple, and if I can, deep and simple at the same time, and not overly complicated linguistically. Simple.
James Dickey, thank you for your time on this program.
Silly.
From Columbia, I'm Patty Just.